Hey, I'm Brian from Leisure Travel Vans, and today we're going to be talking about how to perform an amp draw test on your batteries. So to perform the amp draw test on the batteries, what we're going to need is a voltmeter, and it needs to be a voltmeter that's actually capable of doing amps DC. So in this case, we'd flick that over to amps DC. And typically what we'd like to use is a clamp meter as well, because that way you can clamp directly over top of the cable. It makes it a lot simpler to use. In some cases, they will just use the cable leads like this. That can be used as well. And we might also be using this just to check the actual voltage on the batteries as well. So the reason for doing a battery draw is just to make sure that we don't have an excessive draw on the batteries, excessive power coming out of the batteries. And things that draw from the batteries are the 12-volt systems like the lighting inside the coach, in this case, a multiplex system. Any of those items that are run by the 12-volt batteries, they are creating a draw on the batteries when they're in use. So first thing we want to do is make sure the house battery is fully charged. You can see this one's sitting at least 14.3, so it is fully charged right now. That'll give us a good baseline to make sure the voltage is good on the batteries. So whenever we do the battery draw, what we want to do is make sure the battery disconnect is turned on, but then make sure every component that we know of is turned off. And then at that point, we can determine how much draw is coming out of the batteries. So what we're going to do is, again, make sure the battery disconnect is turned on. We're going to unplug the shore power and make sure the inverter is turned off as well. So another thing to make sure of is the solar panels as well. We want to make sure that you're either indoors, so they're not getting any sunlight, or that you have them covered up. Another option would be to disconnect them by the fuse inside the battery compartment. You can always pull that fuse to make sure that they're completely disconnected and no power is being put into the batteries from the solar panels. So to access the solar panel fuse, we'll have to pull the batteries forward. So this being a Unity, they're inside the step of the entrance here. So we'll open this up. We'll pull this panel out first. And then this panel here. Okay, so once we have those panels out of the way, we'll pull the batteries forward. Once we have the batteries forward, the fuse will be an inline fuse in the back of the battery compartment. You're going to see how it's actually hooked up to the main mega fuse block. So we can open up the cover for that fuse holder and remove the fuse. So this is the fuse holder right here. The fuse is inside there, so we'll have to open this up in order to actually get at the fuse. So in order to remove the fuse, there's just a clip on here that you have to lift up. Once you have that lifted up, you can just open that cover up, and here you'll see the fuse for the solar panels. Once you remove this fuse, there's no power coming into the batteries anymore from the solar panels. To replace the fuse, again, you just make sure that it's seated properly. If they're seated below the terminals, that's not correct. Make sure they're both properly inside the terminals, and it is fully seated. Yeah, once it's fully seated, put the cover back on to make sure it stays watertight. So if by chance you've got a draw on your coach that is still fairly high and you want to determine exactly what that draw is, you can actually pull individual fuses. You can see if that brings the amp draw down. Once you find the fuse that is actually creating the amp draw, you can correspond that to the label inside the fuse panel. And once you find which fuse it's under, you can go to that component and see if that component is still turned on or if it is the one that's actually creating a draw and something else needs to be resolved. So we're going to make sure that the fans are also turned off. So in order to turn them off, we're going to turn them all the way to 0. That'll turn the fans off. We'll also make sure we turn the fridge off because it'll be using power to run the circuit board. We'll also make sure that we turn off the leveling jacks, make sure they're not turned on. Once those items are turned off and unplugged, then we'll also go through the coach and again, turn everything off. So including all the lights. So we'll make sure all the lights are turned off. We'll turn off all the lights. We'll turn off everything else that we know of that runs off of 12-volt power. There will always be some things that will create a draw so long as the battery disconnect is turned on. Things like the multiplex system will still be running in the background, as well as the carbon monoxide detector. These things are things that will always be powered, so they will always create a little bit of a draw with the battery disconnect turned on. So we'll come outside to do the battery draw, and just remember that whenever we're opening up the door, the step is running off of the household power, but so is the light on that's underneath there. Given enough time, I think it's about 10 minutes, the light will turn off and stop that draw as well. But that's another thing to remember, that there is a light underneath the step that will be creating a draw on the batteries. We'll pull the batteries forward so we can access the cables. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use a clamp meter to actually do the battery draw test. And we're going to make sure that we turn the voltmeter all the way to amps DC. That way we can measure the DC amps being drawn out of the batteries. So another thing we want to do before we start the test, you'll see that we need to zero out the monitor. So we're just going to zero that out, make sure it's at 0, and then we can clamp it over top of the cable. So in this case, we've got lithium batteries. The lithium batteries are both 12 volts, so they're wired in parallel to produce 12 volts. If it is 6-volt batteries, like the AGM batteries that we use, they would be wired in series, so they would have the one that's a jumper on there. So right now you can see that there are 2 jumper cables here, and one main positive, one main negative. We're going to put the clamp over top of the main negative cable to measure how much power is being drawn from the batteries. And of course, when you're doing this, make sure the clamp is completely around the cable. If the clamp is open at all, you won't get an accurate reading. So we'll just make sure that's completely around the cable. And as we do that, you can see right now, this coach is drawing roughly 15 amps. That's because we still have a lot of lighting on inside the coach. So we're going to shut everything else down and then see how low we can get this number. We'll turn the master light off, and you can see it immediately drops down to approximately 1, or even now 0.9 of an amp draw. And again, a lot of these things will be happening because right now we do still have the light on for the step down there, plus the multiplex system, and the LP monitor is still on too. So once that light shuts down, we should see this number drop a little bit further again. And there it goes. So right now you can see that this coach is sitting at 0.5 amps being drawn. So that is considered an acceptable number because of things like the multiplex system and the LP running. What we can do to make sure that our test is still being accurate, we can turn on a light. So if I turn on a porch light, you'll see that the amperage will start going up again on the monitor. So you know that we are getting an accurate draw measurement. So now we'll slide the batteries back in place and put the covers back in place. So whenever you slide the batteries back in, we'll just make sure we go nice and parallel. If they do shift, you can always make sure that they're lined up properly with the rails inside there. Once it's all the way in, there's no cables being pinched in the back, we can put these covers back in place as well. To put these covers back in place, we'll just go in there at a little bit of an angle, then slide it in. It may be a little bit tight on top, but we'll just push it in, lock it in place. Then we'll take the bottom cover, again at a bit of an angle, get the front edge in here first, and then you'll notice that it'll be a little bit tight on the back. Push it down in place, and then just close up those handles.